Number 9. Many commands are pastorally limited. Many demands of God are pastorally limited, the pastoral situation being established by the context. Let's take one in 1 Corinthians 7. As I'm sure you are aware, from 1 Corinthians 7 on, Paul is answering questions that have come to him from the Corinthian church by letter. Before that, he is answering questions that have come to him by oral report. Chapters 1 to 4 deal with disunity in the church. 5 and 6, 2 or 3 separate items that have all come by oral report. Now in chapter 7, verse 1, we read, "Now for the matters you wrote about." And then he starts off item after item after item, all the way to the end of the book. And in Greek, almost every time a new item is introduced, is the same expression, now about, now about, now about, and it gives it away. But in most of these items, Paul is concerned not only to answer a particular issue, but to keep warring factions in the church on that issue together. It's quite clear, for example, that in the matter of meat offered to idols in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, there are some people who think it's all right, it's perfectly kosher for Christians to eat food that has previously been offered to idols. And there are some Christians who think that you really shouldn't do that. So they haven't simply written to Paul and say, "Tell us what you know about Christians eating food offered to idols." They've written to Paul and said, "Some of us think this and some of us think that. What do you say?" Which is pastorally a much more difficult situation to handle. What Paul does in these cases is say, to group A, yes, 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 you have some truth, but to group B, yes, 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 you have some truth, but. In other words, because he is interested not only in giving the truth, but winning the people to a common mind, he phrases himself in such a way as to win the people, not just the topic. For example, chapter 7, "Now for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to marry, not to touch a woman. Celibacy has its points. But, since there is so much immorality, each man should have his own wife," and so on. Several of those all through the chapter. Chapter 8, "Now about food sacrificed to idols. We know that we all possess knowledge. Mind you," he says, "knowledge puffs up. That's not a good thing. So then about eating food sacrificed to idols," verse 4, "we know that an idol is nothing at all in the world. There's no God but one God. These idols aren't going to contaminate the meat. The meat is still just meat." Verse 7, "But not everyone knows this." Paul's arguments run on this sort of yes-but line more or less to the end of the book. There are one or two remarkable exceptions. When he gets to the Lord's Supper in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 17 and following, he says, "Now in what I'm about to write to you now, on the Lord's Supper, I have no praise for you, for your meetings do more damage than good." Isn't that interesting? The one central right, ongoing right of the Christian church is precisely the point where Paul says, "I've got nothing good to say to anybody at this point." It's really quite remarkable. Now, granted this yes-but style of argumentation, it becomes extremely easy to pull out a text from one of these flowing contexts and distort Paul. For example, on the tongues issue. "I thank my God I speak in tongues more than all of you." That's what Paul says. But in the church, I'd rather speak 5 words in a known tongue than 10,000 words in an unknown tongue. That is, in church, intelligibility is everything. That's also what Paul says. If you're on the charismatic side, you're likely to cite the first part. If you're on the anti-charismatic side, you're likely to cite the other part. In other words, to deal fairly with Paul, it is extremely important in these yes-but sorts of passages, if we're going to hear him properly, to recognize that part of the shaping of individual texts is constrained by pastoral concerns, and to listen carefully for those concerns as you follow his argument through the text, or we're likely to distort him in serious ways. That is also the case with Jesus' oaths, Jesus' proscription of oaths in Matthew 6 and Matthew 23. There were some Jews in Jesus' day that had developed a complex system of oaths such that they became an excuse for evasive lying. For example, like a little kid who takes the fingers of the hand like this, puts them behind the back and says, "Cross my heart and hope to die, I'll tell you the truth." Then lies through her teeth. Didn't count, had my fingers crossed. And thus this solemn oath of cross my heart and hope to die doesn't mean a thing, because the rules are so complex that you can annul that oath by this device. So, in Jesus' day, if you swore solemnly by the temple, you weren't bound by it. If you swore solemnly while facing the temple, then you were bound by it. If you swore solemnly by the altar, then you weren't bound by it. If you swore solemnly by the sacrifice on the altar, then you were bound by it, and so on. Now, at some point, Jesus comes along and says, enough already. You know, the altar's God's, so you're swearing by God. The sacrifice is God's, so you're swearing by God. You swear by the hair on your head, that's God's too. No matter what you swear by, it's still owned by God, you're still swearing by God. At the end of the day, just tell the truth. Let your yes be yes, and your no be no, and anything more is sinful. On the other hand, if you're a Jehovah's Witness and you hear that, then you make that part of a new legal system. And then you refuse to swear by the Bible or take any sort of similar oath of allegiance in a courtroom or anything, and exceptions are made for you in civil law and so forth, precisely because Jesus said, let your yes be yes and your no be no, and anything more comes from sin. But if there really is this pastoral dimension to what Jesus is doing, then it's important to ask, at least, how all of the early Christians, so far as their actions are recorded in the Bible, understood his words. Paul swears, he takes oaths several times. Does that mean Paul, poor chap, never really did understand Jesus on this point? God himself swears in Hebrews. Does this mean he's guilty of evasive lying? No, of course not. The point is that oaths ought to have the function of reassuring hearers. Now, within that kind of framework, that's what Paul is doing when he puts himself under an oath. Now, Paul tells the truth all the time, so far as his readers are concerned, so far as Paul himself projects himself. He's telling the truth. He wants his readers to believe him all the time. But about some point where he feels especially passionate, and where he fears they may not understand him or believe him, he puts himself under an oath to enhance his credibility, not to say, and elsewhere, you may understand I'm really pulling your leg. And so when God then swears by himself in an oath in the Epistle of the Hebrews, the whole point of the exercise is to increase our faith, to enhance his credibility, not to introduce some new standard in lying. So again, there is a pastoral limitation indicated by the literary and historical context, which must be grasped if we're to handle these things aright. Now, one of the most interesting sets in this regard is the doctrine of assurance. We're still on number 9, aren't we? And I promised some time for discussion. I've got 12 of these points. Let me finish my number 9, if I may. We'll open it up for discussion. And I may just run into the first few minutes of next day with the last 3, if I can have your permission that way, before we go on to Jean. May I do that? Either that, or I can rabbit on through this lot very quickly, but then you won't get any interesting illustrations.